Thank you very much. That was fascinating, wonderful material. The audience will have a chance now, if they want to click on the box at the bottom of the screen and mark Q&A. I'll open it up. Once they type questions in there, I'll relay them. I was fascinated by that. I was thinking when you were talking about Longman's and Lang's causeries, actually of a talk we had earlier today from Benedict Costa, who was talking about Patrick Geddes and the Scottish College in Montpellier. And she showed us a slide of his garden and talked about it as embodied cosmopolitanism, and talked about the way in which he built into the design of the garden interconnections. You know, her comparison was actually with a periodical, with the Evergreen.
Oh, interesting.
And I was just thinking there's a similar comparison to be made with your reading of Lang's causeries, that the, you know, they're so sort of agile in the way that they move around and jump. That was that term that you used from Hensley, thinking about so jump between topics and the way they gather in and enact interconnections between Scotland and the rest of the world. I thought that was fascinating. So just looking at the Q&A, there's a question here from Fraser Riddell, who says, thanks you for the lecture, says, I find a discussion of Lang's causerie fascinating, especially on the question of originality or recycling. And he asks if you can see other examples of this style or genre in Fin de Siècle periodicals. It strikes me, he writes, as very similar to Lafcadio's Hearn's journalism in New Orleans in the 1880s, where he introduces readers of English to the strange and the exotic in French literature.
Interesting. And there were so many. I haven't looked at them all. Israel Zangwill had one in The Idler, for example, in the 1890s. So that was one. As I discovered, it was very short-lived, but even Graham Thompson, she was considered to be, this is a woman poet. She became Rosamund Marriott Watson, and I've written her biography. She was considered to be a very witty 1890s figure, and in fact was promoted by Lang until she had a second elopement and divorce, and he fucked her. But at any rate, she was given a causerie for a while and could let it run for a couple of times. So you actually even had occasionally, I mean, in this case, a woman's causerie. So I think you could find these in many places. And I guess I would argue two things about that. On one hand, we can just see the nascent globalism coming ever more clearly into focus. And on the other hand, what we're seeing is, this was my contribution to the 1880s on that volume you were mentioning, which involves Lang and Dobson and Goss and others on the fixed form revival, is that I end up arguing the form of that is the transatlantic periodical, because they are shooting print back and forth so quickly, it allowed this vogue of fixed forms simply to explode, which were cosmopolitan in themselves because of the French derivation of fixed form verse. So I think it is about the speed. By the time you get a fully developed transatlantic cable and cables going elsewhere, you got those steam run printing presses, cheap print. Print is just circulating like mad. And so I think you get both this materialist cosmopolitanism in the form of paper circulating, or in that wonderful example of the garden. I wish I'd heard that. That's fascinating. But you also get mental senses of infinite space almost, that you can move around. It's just becoming what? An expected thing. It's been normalized that your mind can take in so much more than the provincial and what is here right now, because it's being enabled by the circulation of print.
Yeah, thank you. I see a couple of comments in reply to that from on the Q&A. So Stefano Evangelista says that it's fascinating that you should mention Zangwill in that context, since Lang and Zangwill both worked as literary correspondence from London for the American Cosmopolitan magazine. He says they were both, quotes, marginal writers who represented Britain and London. And then Benedict, who's in the audience, has said it's fascinating. What's really interesting a bit about is how Lang inserts Scottish literature within British literature and culture and posits it firmly on a par with English literature. Benedict's question is, do we have any inkling about how readers responded to
the only thing I guess I would say is he kept writing his column for 19 years. I mean, you know, if interest had waned enough, it would have disappeared. But also, I think the number of reprintings and excerptings, and that Nathan Hensley comment I'll go back to, he was so famous, he was almost a cliche. And I think he caught the temper of the times. You know, as other critics of Lang have commented, it could make everybody feel high culture. He's mentioning all of these cosmopolitan names, French names, you know, Russian, whatever, American, but he didn't go too deep because he's always in a hurry. He's rushing about. And so the idea that you could feel you had read something cultured and were in conversation with a highly cultured mind, but in an entertaining form that didn't ask too much of you. So the real answer is no, I can't tell you, except just the kind of gossip among Fin de Siècle writers that I've seen. But I have never, it would take a lot of diligence, in fact, to find letters to the editor commenting on how wonderful he is. Possibly there's something from the Longmans archive, but I have never investigated that to find out that dimension. But it's a great question. It's a great question.
Michael, I think you had a question. Is that right?
Yes, no, I did. Just want to say thank you so much, Linda. That was a brilliant presentation, and I love the idea of discursive cosmopolitanism with Lang, and I think we see it in the fairy tales as well, where he'll often give us a kind of Jacobite Scottish tale, and then he'll put it alongside these other fairy tales from across the globe. It's something very similar about these fairy tale traditions that he's trying to range Scottish literature amongst. My question regards that final page of the article that you shared, the brilliant discussions there where he's talking about his experiences of reading German and then his experiences of reading Scottish lit, and he's struggling with both of them. That part where he's baffled by Sentimental Tommy, and I kind of share that bafflement because sometimes Barry is just so obscure and localised in the Scots that you do have to get the dictionary out to understand it. So I was just wondering if you could say a bit more about that, kind of his position there as translating or trying to fathom these two different languages, one that you would think he's quite at home with, but he feels alienated from. And I'm wondering if this might have any relationship to cosmopolitanism, actually, in a way. I'm reminded back to earlier on in the discussion where Stefano was outlining what cosmopolitanism might be, or a definition of it, and it was feeling at home in the unfamiliar and unfamiliar at home. I just thought that kind of resonates quite nicely with Lang's reading of Barry, where this is something that should feel at home, but he's unfamiliar with it. But it's a text that was received well across the planet, you know, despite this unfamiliar language.
Yes, I mean, it is interesting. First of all, you will, I suspect, know far more, given the book you've just written, Michael, about the context than I. But I do think it's interesting that he doesn't care much for Sentimental Tommy, and I would say two things. It's a rival journalist in Bookman, and second, it is sentimental. I mean, it's kind of heading towards Kailyard work. You know, the more localized and contained and constrained. And he is so convinced that Scott travels, you know, worldwide, and that Stevenson, who's literally traveling. So it's not distance from the past. He's always a little bit more fond of Scots from the past, the language, you know, with the ballads and so forth. And he mentions a ballad that he'd written in rivalry with William Black in that same column. So I thought, well, I've got to look at that. And it's all written in Scots. I didn't know all the words. I couldn't read it without a glossary. So Andrew Lang was enough of a linguist really to be able to move between those registers of elegant Oxonian English and Scots language and Old French, and to have good relations. I mean, he collaborated with Brander Matthews in America. So I don't know that I can answer the question fully about why he picks Barry, except that Barry, he doesn't immediately embody the kind of masculinity that Lang tends to favor, more heroic, swashbuckling, defending the romance genre, liking H. Rider Haggard, which is a little beyond most of my abilities, but a Barry who has a more circumscribed view. So he finds that unfamiliar, I think, because this would be my speculation. It's not worldly enough, right? It's not. It doesn't open onto other literatures, other languages, other spaces in the same way that a Stevenson novel can, when it compares Jekyll and Hyde, which apparently was not selling all that well until Lang wrote his column, and then it took off. But he compares it to the tales of E.T.A. Hoffmann, you know, so he's immediately going to the continent to give him his full due. So that's a rambling and highly speculative answer, but on the spot, that would be how I'd begin. What would you say? I'm curious about you.
Part of me thinks that he was just baffled by the language that Barry was using, because it is so difficult. But I do take your point, and I think you're right in the sense that Barry's not drawing explicit cosmopolitan kind of connections in the same way that Lang or Stevenson would do. So yeah, I think it raises a question of where does Barry sit in relation to cosmopolitanism? I suppose that's for another discussion.
Yes.
So
yes.
In the chat, Katrina has sort of expressed a worry about the language that we use to talk about how Scotland relates to the rest of the world. I mean, talking about inserted into and placed in the world, she says we need to think about how important Scots were for creating the means by which cosmopolitanism works or doesn't work, and points out that there are many prominent Scots working in London journals, David Masson on Buchan on The Spectator. But there's also a question on the Q&A from Alison Chapman, who's a participant in this project. And if it's okay, I don't know if this is all right with Alison, I might bring her, promote her to panelist and bring her in so that we can have video and audio from her. I hope that's okay, Alison. So if I click this should promote Alison to a panelist, because she has a question too about kind of the London base Longman. So yes, so Alison,
I'll show you this video. I haven't seen Alison in a while and I miss her. Hello.
Alison, it's good to see you. So you had a question about Longmans and London.
Yes, I was really fascinated by the talk. Thank you so much, Linda. And I'm interested in place-based poetics at the moment, especially at the end of the 19th century. And so I was interested in the concept of discursive cosmopolitanism and how specific places are mediated, as well as imaginary places. But I was particularly interested in the fact that Longmans is a London-based magazine, and that Lang also predominantly has a London base as well. So does the London identity of the magazine and Lang, does it in some way kind of, sort of struggling for a phrase here, but does it potentiate the cosmopolitanism? Can it potentiate it, or does it somehow make it messier or enriches it? Like, how would you, if you were to think about how London operates here in terms of the Scottish cosmopolitanism, how would you approach it?
Well, I would say in the first place that Lang never contests the fact that London is a center of publishing. Almost everything he's going to cite first appears there, you know, the friendly treatment to Tennyson and so forth. So he does not, as it were, he's practicing the kind of cosmopolitanism of an Appio, or some of those in the readings where he is both at home locally. Well, he's not at home. He has multiple centers of allegiance, because there's no question where home really is in this column. It's Scotland for him personally, but the world of letters is his literary home. And he is also fully embracing that in print. I will add just one other thing about Fraser's and place and, Longman's, and it was a Freudian slip, and place, because it's what came after Fraser's closed down. And of course, what is the heritage of Fraser's? It too was edited from London by an Irishman, William McGinn, and had the Ettrick Shepherd as a regular contributor, and you know, and the kind of Noctis Ambrosia with some Scots participants. So it's Longmans grew out of a journal that was already mixing places and identities associated with specific places, but then appropriating them and appropriating the freedom to move amidst them all. But I don't know that I've answered your question. I'd love to hear any thoughts you had on this, since you're looking specifically at place and poetics, and including periodicals. Yeah, I'd love to hear what you have to say.
That was a very rich answer, thank you. I don't really have much more to add, except I like the way you have positioned this in terms of complicated appropriations. And possibly going back to your drawing of Nathan's work on actor network theory, right? That might also help frame cosmopolitanism in terms of complexities of places and their symbolisms too.
That's an excellent point. And even I would say it occurred to me that it's a kind of curatorial cosmopolitanism. One is, you know, the way we curate websites or you know, assemblages on the web, that Lang is also being a curator of world culture. Partly it's just what occurs to him at the moment. He wrote so fast, there's no question he didn't sit down and say, I shall craft this week's column. So it really is that kind of schematic of a mind's journeys, but it's also, he didn't choose everything. It's also kind of curatorial. And I think that's one of the things that happens. What gets reprinted? What goes around in print from one continent to another, from one magazine to another, since there was no copyright on periodical quotations or excerpts as there were for books. So yeah, great point, Alison.
Brilliant. I think I'm gonna, if it's all right, I'll return Alison back to the audience.
Bye, Alison.
There we go. On that last point about kind of curating, one of the things that struck me was whether there are kind of parallels here with the way that Matthew Potolsky reads decadence. So, he talks about decadence as an imagined republic, and he draws on the work of Benedict Anderson there, the idea of imagined community, and thinking about periodicals again. But in his account of the imagined decadent republic, he characterizes decadence as what he calls an epidictic mode. In other words, decadent writers spend their time pointing out the other decadent writers that they like, and in that way they kind of form a community an imagined community. And there's sort of a link between that mode and what you're describing in Lang. But then on the other hand, writers associated with decadence in this period, people like George Moore, for example, really don't like Lang very much.
Oh no,
no. Yeah.
Yes, I mean, just think about Haggard and Lang, who collaborated on works, versus what I would associate with the kind of arch decadence. You know, I mean, I can't put Huysmans and Lang together by any stretch of the mind. Yes, I thought I liked that idea very much of that republic of letters and the freedom it gives. Of course, it's being challenged again. That is the Benedict Anderson with how these things go on. But yeah, I think there is that element in which he, and again, there is, I think you almost described decadent log rolling.
Yeah. Well,
in essence, by epideictic rhetoric, which is something I hear a lot about in my department from classical rhetoric colleagues. Yes, the rhetoric of praise and blame plays such a role in forming identities, especially national identities. So it would make great sense to have this epideictic function within, or among rather, decadent writers. And it's what Lang in some ways is doing. It's just he's not promoting the decadence.
No. Well, the other person who comes to mind who's linked with causeries would be Arthur Symons.
Yeah.
He writes his columns in the Savoy are called causerie as well.
Oh yes.
I think so.
Yes.
Yes. But there's a question from Q&A from Petra Reed, who asks how Lang's praise for Walter Scott, who is notorious for his steadying of the Hanoverian succession, chime with his own member of the hardline Legitimatist League, this being the organisation devoted to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy. And she describes this as a colourful manifestation of Fin de Siècle Scots cosmopolitanism. So yeah, how does his praise for Scott chime with his own kind of interests in the Stuart monarchy?
Well, this is probably too simplistic an answer to that really fine question. But I mean, I just remember Lang as a lowland Scot. In the end, he's not a Highlander. He is lowlands, as was Scott himself, though his imagination went to the Highlands. I mean, Scott, the very first thing I think about is, yes, and that may have been what Petra's reference was to his arranging in Edinburgh the royal investiture and welcome of George IV. I think I have that right. Yeah, when the Prince Regent became George IV. Is that right? My timing may be off. I never get the sense that Lang is a political quietist. Yes, I think in fact there is a politics to his column. If nothing else, it's loud and clear in his handling of race. It would be fair to say, coming from my country at this time, it's a white supremacist column. That is just a kind of given the superiority of English and European cultures. So I think that's a given, but otherwise he's a political quietist. He's not going to take up a cause. And he's not, I think, approaching Scott as a political writer. Of course one could. This is about the past, about heroic attempts, about a rich heritage of balladry and folklore and so forth, which I think I would tie more closely to the idea of the Celtic revival and the kind of folk incarnations that William Sharp and others would do. So again, I'm not sure, Petra, I've fully addressed your question, but I think maybe I'm saying Lang just danced around that issue.
Petra has typed an emphatic yes into the I think it's approval.
I'm glad.
There's a couple of posts here from Sean Reynolds again. So Sean has posted a correction to something that came up in the previous session about Patrick Geddes. Apparently, the visitors' book of the Collège des Écossais is in Strathclyde University, not in Aberdeen or in Edinburgh, as was mooted before. So we're slowly moving around Scotland. He has a question about Buchan, who was London-based. And he was very instrumental in the project by the Edinburgh publisher Nelson to publish cheap books in French in the 1900s. Are there any connections between his activities there and Lang? As somebody
and give me the name again. I didn't.
I think it's about Buchan and about the Edinburgh publisher Nelson.
Okay. And you know, I'm very sorry, but I'm going to have to plead ignorance on that one. I just have not looked into Buchan. Maybe because I had a Scottish-born, very conservative colleague who loved Buchan, and it didn't invite me in. So I do apologize. I just don't have the expertise, but perhaps you and Matthew and you, Michael, could answer that more fully than I'm able to.
I don't think I wouldn't dare speculate about Buchan, not least because I haven't read him for about 20 years. I don't know about Michael, if you want to come in.
No, to be honest, I mean, I've read quite a bit of Buchan, but not much on his role in publications and his relationship to Nelson. But yeah, Shan, it sounds like a really fascinating connection that we should be thinking about, because it's not just, I suppose what we want to do here is not just think about sort of ideas of cosmopolitanism, but it is that question of circulation. What is actually being printed in Scotland and what Scottish texts are being exported elsewhere? So I think it's a really useful one, which I'll go and look up now and see if we can find out more information about it.
Very good.
The Buchan I know, it tends to be, you know, the anti-Semitic, racist Buchan of the 1920s and 30s. But I do remember at a conference, I can't remember, a few years ago now, on aestheticism and modernism, which was organised by Alex Murray, who was in the audience here, and Kate Hext. There was a really interesting talk about Buchan's earlier work, which was trying to make connections between him and Decadence, as a writer who might be more cosmopolitan, perhaps less. We're coming up. We've got over the hour now, and I think I mean there's one question left in the Q&A. I might kind of put that and then bring this to a close, if that's all right. So Fraser, who asked a question earlier, says, he suggests that could the causeries be read as training in certain reading practices or modes of attention? He said, could they be a form of cosmopolitan cognition? And he suggests the work of Nicholas Dames on the physiology of the novel might be interesting.
My tentative answer would be yes and no. On one hand, an incredible list of recommended books to go check out. I mean, think about how many books and articles and new poets Lang is introducing week after week after week. An incredible list of things to follow up on. However, again, I come back to that no, insofar as not delving too deeply, maybe a kind of surface cosmopolitanism. And more important, this I think would be the constructive training, receptivity. The notion that things from elsewhere, things that are different, I'm reading it at home, but it is unfamiliar, to pick up on what you were saying of Stefano's talk earlier. That, I think, was a conditioning of receptivity. Maybe not an active reading, because I wouldn't have been able to keep up myself with a month, perhaps, of what Lang was recommending and bringing to attention. It would take such in-depth work. But obviously, he was a man who could read unusually fast and also write unusually fast. That's his particular gift. But I think he is shaping a kind of outlook. Training may be too specific, so that's why I like receptivity.
Brilliant, thank you. Alex has just posted to remind me that the person who talked about Buchan and Decadence is a man called James Mackin, whose book on weird fiction appeared in 2018. And in fact, now I remember that book has chapters on Buchan's early work, that book, Weird Fiction. It's very confusing. James Mackin, who writes about Arthur Machen, but Mackin with an I. Anyway, thank you so much, Linda. This has been wonderful. Thank you to everybody in the audience. Thank you for your questions. Thank you to Alison for being prepared to come on at very short notice like that and participate. Lovely to see you. Lovely to see you. I'm hopeful that we'll be able to find ways to carry on some of the issues, discussion about some of the issues that are opened up today, using a forum on the project website, which we're working on now. Some people have signed up for it. We had some technical problems with the website today. But thank you so much to Linda. Thank you to Michael, and thank you to all of you for attending. This has been a great session.
Okay, thank you.
And now, as seems to be traditional, I'm going to do the Zoom wave and the end.
I'm glad to see this.
So this is the Zoom wave. Goodbye to all of you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.